Your Excellencies, my lords, ladies, saints and gentlemen, I now come to the really important course of this dinner. That is to say, to introduce Professor Charles Best. He does not, of course, on paper need any introduction to whatever, because he is world famous as the co-discoverer of insulin in 1921. You may, however, some of you, feel that there's a catch in this, because you must be looking round for some grey-bearded old gentleman who has tottered into this room unseen by you. I would like to explain, though, that my friend Professor Best, who is on my right, so that there should be no misunderstanding about this, was only a medical student when he made, or helped to make, this stupendous discovery. After the warning given us last night in the Addison lecture about talking about infant prodigies, which Professor Best was present at, I hesitate to use the term because it has certain implications which I won't bother you with now. But at the same time, we must feel that he was, to say the least of it, perhaps precocious, if you will not think that in offensive terms, because he is, I suspect, even younger than myself, and I feel I'm very young. He is, in spite of being such a distinguished physiologist, quite a good doctor, I gather, because he has the doctorates of at least 12 universities in who's who, and probably one or two up his sleeve. He is also not a narrow specialist, because quite apart from insulin and diabetes, he has spread his net very widely indeed, even into my own particular small field in the last few months. However, as this is a historical club, historical medical club, I'd better just give you a very brief historical resume, because Professor Best is the seventh generation from the Isle of Wight. They went over there at the end of the 18th century, I believe I'm correct in saying so, and his first representative, great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, perhaps, was a member of the first legislative assembly, which ever assembled in those parts. And there has been a hiatus until now in the political world, until very recently his son, also only aged 25, crashed into Parliament over there in a very big way with an enormous majority, and is apparently all set for an almost equally distinguished career in a different field, and I think that is a very important event. Finally, although Professor Best has had so many honours in the world that it's rather stupid to talk about them, I feel. You've only got to read all the books of reference. I think that he is best loved by me for the one which he mentioned to me last night, the only one he mentioned to me last night. That is to say that he was elected to my own club, the Athenaeum, under the famous Rule 2, and I believe he's practically the only doctor who's ever been so. So I shall introduce now Professor Best to give the 108th, well, it isn't really the 108th oration, but the oration on the 108th anniversary of Sir William Osler's birth, and ask you to give him your full attention.
Mr. President, my Lord, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's a very great honor, particularly for a Canadian, to give this Osler oration. I've spent most of my active medical life in the vicinity of the places where Sir William Osler was born, where he was brought up, and near the schools that he attended. As an undergraduate in medicine, I belonged to an Osler Club, which was headed by my friend Norman Gwynn, who was a nephew of Sir William Osler, the son of one of Sir William's sisters. Norman Gwynn steeped us in the Osler tradition over the many years. A niece of Sir William Osler's, the daughter of Sir Edmund Osler, was a great friend of my wife's and of mine. Once on an ocean crossing, she had to make the difficult decision to have me for her clinician or the ship's doctor. Mrs. Boyd, I think, on that occasion, was even prepared to have me remove her appendix if necessary, but fortunately that did not have to be done. I'm not speaking this evening on Sir William Osler, but on the discovery of insulin. It is certainly true that most, if not all, rapid and dramatic additions to biological and medical knowledge rest on a foundation provided by a very large number of earlier workers. This was the case with insulin. One of my friends has recently collected the photographs of 300 individuals who have made their contributions in the field of diabetes and insulin. There have been approximately 45,000 scientific publications on insulin since our first in 1922. And those who are supposed to know tell us that approximately 20 million people the world over have received insulin. This is not the place to discuss in any detail the history of diabetes mellitus, but it was, of course, the attention which this clinical condition demanded that set the stage for the production of experimental diabetes and for the isolation of insulin. Last summer, I gave the Addison Memorial Lecture. My great friend, Sir Henry Dale, was in the chair at Guy's Hospital. He was in the chair again last evening when Professor Parks gave this lecture. Dr. Copeman was also present last year when I attempted to review the history of diabetes, traveling all the way from the first mention in the Papyrus Ebers down through the work of Celsus, Neritius, and Paracelsus, and the scores of others who made their contribution to the field. And then, in more recent years, Langerhans, who discovered these structures in the abdominal sweetbread, the pancreas, the structures which we now know are responsible for making insulin. I referred to Rollo, the English physician, Claude Bernard, Bouchardar, Pavey, and many other investigators. Many workers had failed in their attempt to remove the pancreas completely from animals, or they had the bad luck to use species of animals which do not suffer from diabetes after complete removal of the pancreas. There was a man named von Brunner in the 1600s who very nearly succeeded and actually did produce some of the signs of diabetes at that very early date. He was more interested in other matters, however, and missed the credit for this very great discovery, which was made by von Mering and Minkowski in 1889. They settled this great matter. Removal of this organ from the dog and in other species of animals produces rapidly fatal diabetes. The first serious attempt to make an extract of this organ was carried out by Minkowski soon after his work in 1889. But simple extracts of the pancreas were not found to possess any potency. I'll not have time to discuss. By the way, I'm not going to read this manuscript, I'm going to be through in a half an hour. But there are some documents here from which I will quote. Professor Minkowski was not able to obtain any evidence for the presence of an internal secretion. It's fascinating to go over the various papers and see how very close some of the workers came to this goal. Minkowski's work stimulated dozens of people to try to extract an active principle from the pancreas. Some of the workers were handicapped through lack of good surgical technique. And an animal riddled with infection is a poor subject on which to test for the anti-diabetic substance. Insulin has no effect on animals, small doses of insulin, if they are suffering from infection, as a great many of the test animals used by our predecessors did. There were very few serious attempts to find the internal secretion of the pancreas after good micro-methods were elaborated for the determination of the sugar in the blood. Dr. Sulzer in 1908 came very near indeed to the goal, but he used the wrong reagents, strong alkali, which must have destroyed all the insulin in making some of his extracts, but on other occasions he probably did have some insulin present. His material was tested in Minkowski's clinic in 1909, but apparently the toxic effects outweighed the anti-diabetic ones. That was really the last serious attempt to use a pancreatic extract on human beings before the work began in Toronto. There was a Dr. Scott in New York City who also came very near, but his concentration of alcohol, which he extracted the pancreas, was too high, and he threw away the wrong fraction and spent many years of his life testing a material, an extract, which could not have had any insulin in it. The other day in New York, a Banting medal was given to Dr. Merlin, partly for his work in experimental diabetes, but more because he discovered a substance that puts the blood sugar up, glucagon. He was the first to name this material, which has some very interesting effects. It was a contaminant of insulin for 20 years or more. There was a Dr. Palesko working in the Balkan states who, just before Banting and I began, had some real evidence of the presence of insulin, but his blood sugar methods were most unreliable, some of the values indeed unbelievable. But he also, I think, came very near to finding insulin. Several investigators had used exactly the same working hypothesis which Dr. Banting formulated. If Professor MacLeod had been familiar with those papers, Professor MacLeod was the head of the department in Toronto, and a very well-informed man in carbohydrate metabolism, and a very cautious Scot. If Professor MacLeod had known about these other papers, I feel quite sure that the work in Toronto would never have started. There's some papers that have just recently been made available. I'll tell you their origin a little later. But Banting wrote in September 1922, my interview with Professor MacLeod lasted about an hour. I told him carefully what I'd planned. And to my disappointment, he did not seem to be interested, and so on. After a while, he said, Professor MacLeod began to talk. He thought that this might be a means of getting rid of the external secretion. This was to tie the pancreatic ducts and to wait for a while until other cells in the pancreas degenerated. As far as he knew, Professor MacLeod said this had never been tried before. It was worth trying, he told Banting, because negative results would be of great physiological value. Banting says here, this latter phrase he repeated at least 3 times. Of course, Banting got more and more irritated every time that was said, because he wasn't interested in negative results. And So Professor MacLeod was quite definitely under the impression that Banting's hypothesis was a novel one. I've reserved for special mention the work which Dr. Starling, Professor Starling, did in 1912 and 1913 with Knowlton and later with Patterson. They used a special preparation which Professor Starling was very expert, heart-lung preparation it was called, and they made extracts of pancreas, and they really got some evidence of the presence in pancreatic extracts of a material which increased the utilization of sugar. But it was Professor J.J.R. MacLeod who challenged Starling's results and said they were not due to an internal secretion of the pancreas, but probably to variations in the storage of sugar in this preparation, and that these fluctuations were responsible for the Starling's finding and not an internal secretion. Starling and Knowlton subsequently withdrew their earlier claims. Just before the Second World War, a number of textbooks were published, or new editions came out. Professor MacLeod's book appeared for the first time. I'm not going over the statements made in those textbooks in 1920 and 21, but Professor Starling said very definitely that no evidence for an internal secretion, and so did Professor MacLeod. Professor MacLeod really favored the view that these little areas in the pancreas, 1% of the total area of the pancreas, did not provide an internal secretion, but were detoxifying centers. They destroyed some poison which, in the absence or after damage to the pancreas, was responsible for the diabetic state. I feel sure that Professor MacLeod favored this view because he discussed the subject exhaustively in a long series of lectures in the academic session of 1920 and 21 when I was a demonstrator in physiology. I mention this particularly because I think it was this conviction, Professor MacLeod's, and the fact that he was a very tired man, which accounted in large part for the extremely cool reception which Banting and his idea received in the autumn of 1920 and in the spring of 1921. Writing after the discovery of insulin, Professor MacLeod's recollection of the encouragement he gave Banting was appreciably warmer than, to my certain knowledge, was actually the case. I shall not attempt to describe here again my admiration for Fred Banting's courage and perseverance. He was entirely responsible for the initiation of the work which we did together. You all know his training in surgery, and that was one of the great assets that we had. Our other very great asset was the possession of accurate chemical knowledge for the micro-determination of blood sugar and ketone bodies, and estimation of the gaseous exchange of animals, and so on. That is, the techniques which the chemists and biochemists had made available over the years was of very great service to us indeed. Fred Banting was highly motivated to make a contribution to knowledge. He was interested in diabetes in part because a childhood friend of his had died in diabetic coma. I'm sure that he would have attacked some other problem if the fates had not conspired to interest him in diabetes. My own interest in this disorder had been aroused by the illness of an aunt who had gone from Nova Scotia to train as a nurse in the Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston. She had helped my medical father in his small hospital, and she died of diabetes a few years before insulin became available. I was a part-time demonstrator in physiology in 1920 and 21 in Professor MacLeod's department. That was my 5th year in the university. I had a research problem with another student in physiology, and this was the pathway of these piqûre impulses of Claude Bernard, the great French experimental physiologist. He had found that if you made a lesion in a certain area of the brain, the animals became diabetic. And we could repeat these observations, and we're studying the pathway of these impulses. And therefore, I was able to master these micro methods for blood sugar, and for ketone bodies and so on, to which I've already referred. I was taking a course called Physiology and Biochemistry, which led to a bachelor's degree, which I received just before I began work with Banting. A medical student, if you like, but I was also not quite certain that I was going on in medicine at that time. In biochemistry, my problem was Dakin's butyl alcohol method for the separation of amino acids. And I had been told to hydrolyze a wheat protein gliadine and to do the separation of amino acids. This had never been done before, and I spent a large part of my time that year doing just that. This experience in biochemistry was soon to be proved very useful because the methods there of alcoholic fractionation and so on had their place in the purification of insulin. And so the day after my final examinations in physiology and biochemistry in 1921, 16th of May, the 17th of May was set for the start of the work with Banting. It was really inevitable that Professor MacLeod should ask me to work with Fred Banting because I was the only student available. The only one who had made up his mind to work through the summer and to take a Master of Arts degree in physiology. Professor MacLeod's statement to me, which I wrote down a little bit later in 1922, "There is no money available for a stipend for you. It'll be a wild goose chase, but you'll learn a lot of surgical technique from Fred Banting." Well, I had learned a very great deal from Professor MacLeod, and I had a very great admiration for him. I always had a very great admiration for his knowledge and teaching ability. Fred Banting and I became very firm friends, and we had a wonderful 7 months of work together, from May to December 1921. We had some troubles and disappointments, but we eventually prepared, without a single failure, potent extracts from degenerative dog's pancreas, from the intact pancreas of the dog, from the pancreas of the fetal calf, and from adult beef pancreas, on 75 consecutive occasions of potent anti-diabetic preparation. These extracts invariably produced a fall in blood sugar in our diabetic dogs. In many cases, this was accompanied by unmistakable clinical improvement in these completely pancreatized animals. The results were so dramatic that the clinical application of our findings was constantly in our minds, and we hoped and expected to see these sweeping falls in blood sugar in diabetic human subjects and to watch them become bright and active and normal as our canine patients did. I wish that I could recapture for you the excitement and the hopes and the pride in the welfare of our dogs which we experienced during the nights and days of the summer and autumn of 1921. As Fred Banting wrote, all went merrily until the end of September, when the professor returned. Professor MacLeod had been away all summer. We had the laboratory to ourselves. We made good use of it. There's no lack of equipment. It wasn't in our laboratory, it was in somebody else. No one else was there for the summer. And for the whole time, we got along beautifully. We not only established beyond doubt the presence of insulin, but noted the production of hypoglycemia by an overdose of insulin. In August 1921, in our notebooks, there's a dramatic example of low blood sugar produced by a large dose of insulin. We deliberately attempted that, and we cured it with sugar. We noted the destructive effect of alkali. We established the usefulness of alcohol as an extractive and selected the concentration which is still used today in the commercial preparation of insulin. We recorded the insolubility of insulin in strong alcohol and in fat solvents. We made further plans for the purification of insulin and for long continued observations on animals, for studies on the burning of sugar, we call the respiratory quotient, and effect on fat and glycogen deposition, on growth, and so on. Our notebook records the first experiment on the action of insulin. That is, apart from the effect on blood and sugar and excretion, we tried to see whether the addition of our active extract to blood in a test tube increased the rate of disappearance of sugar from that blood, and we found that it had no effect. I had listened to many lectures on this subject by Professor MacLeod. These were condensed into an article published in the first volume of Physiological Reviews, The Sugar of the Blood. We concluded that insulin accelerated the removal of sugar from the blood and not the utilization in the blood itself. Of course, the experiments would have to be done much more carefully before they would bear the light of publication. This was done later. We knew that we had certain evidence of the presence of insulin, and we knew of some of its properties. But we had no assistants and no junior workers, and none were assigned to us until late in the autumn of 1921, when we did have one part-time laboratory assistant. I'll just read what Banting says about this. Shortly after Professor MacLeod's return, the last week of September, I asked him for four things: a salary, because I was already deeply in debt and couldn't borrow any more money, a room to work in. We shared a small room with several other workers, a boy to look after the dogs, for we frequently had to clean the cages and the operating room ourselves, and some way of making the operating room floor waterproof so that we could wash it down and get away from the infections which plagued us. Well, Professor MacLeod was not inclined to give us those things. He said that other researches were just as important, and I remember that meeting, and I'm afraid both Professor MacLeod and Dr. Banting got a little annoyed at each other. Professor MacLeod said to Fred Banting, or I think Banting said, "I'll consult the president of the university." But Professor MacLeod said, probably quite rightly, he said, "Banting, as far as you are concerned, I am the university." And, this is recorded here. Well, I won't go. A little later, Professor MacLeod became more interested, and he did provide a part-time laboratory assistant. I think his idea really was to let us go on and prove beyond doubt that we had accomplished more than our predecessors. But we, of course, felt that we'd done that long before he returned, and were anxious to get on with a lot of other problems. As far as I can see, Professor MacLeod's reaction to our work passed through several stages. He was really quite disinterested at first. And that was a disappointment to me, because I had a tremendous admiration for him. When our results were communicated to him, he was mildly interested. We wrote to him when he was in Scotland. When he came back to Toronto, he was deeply chagrined for some reason I never could understand. And a little later, there was a campaign, I think, perhaps it was justified. He decided to take over the complete direction of the work himself. And that's where he of course, encountered a great resistance, considerable resistance from both Banting and myself. Professor Collop, who had been working in Toronto on a year's leave of absence from Alberta, had approached Fred Banting many times with offers of help. And Banting has recorded that Dr. Collop begged to be allowed to participate in the development of our discovery. Professor MacLeod was not in favor of this at first, but later he did agree, and in December in 1921, the further purification of our extract was entrusted to Dr. Collop. We had made certain advances. We knew the solubility in alcohol, the insolubility in strong alcohol and fat solvents, and inactivation by alkali. The fact that an opalescence developed when a solution of the material was added to strong alcohol, and these facts were given to Dr. Collop. I was opposed to Dr. Collop's participation in the work for pretty obvious reasons. I wanted to get on and do it myself, but there were too many things to do. And Fred Banting persuaded me that it was better to give up this part of the work, and I did go on with what I thought was the key problem, the effect of insulin on the utilization of sugar. Dr. Collop soon formed a liaison with Professor MacLeod, and quite frankly and honestly, Fred Banting, a guest worker in the department, and myself a very junior one, we found ourselves in opposition to a brace of full professors who appreciated to the full the obvious and certainly glorious potentialities of our findings in both experimental and clinical fields. Banting's bitterness knew no bounds, and when he found that preparations were being made for the clinical trial of Collop's improvement on our extract, he sprang into action. He'd been away from the laboratory, Fred Banting had, for more and more because there was nothing for him to do. He'd reached the end of the application of his surgical experience, and he was very anxious to participate in the clinical work on insulin, but there were some difficulties there. I remember I was working in a small room on making extracts of pancreas when Fred burst in upon me and said we must get very busy and make an extract which would be tried on the first diabetic. Dr. Joseph Gilchrist, friend of ours, was our guinea pig. We gave him a large cocktail of insulin on 24th of December 1921. Insulin by mouth, it had no effect. And then, about a week or two later, boy Leonard Thompson, the first diabetic to get insulin, received an extract which Fred Banting and I had made. It was potent. We tried it on diabetic dogs and on ourselves. And it did have an effect on Leonard Thompson. I had held out for the use of fetal calf pancreas at that time because it was 10 or 15 times as potent as that from whole beef pancreas. But Fred Banting recorded, we mustn't do that. They will say that we have not used a commercially available source. And so it was an extract of adult beef pancreas made with slightly acid alcohol, and then filtered, extracted with ether and so on, and finally suspended or dissolved in salt solution and put through a Birkfeld filter. This did give an effect on Leonard Thompson. Banting's own words in describing this, on January the 10th, 1922, a Birkfelded sterile extract made by Best and myself was given to Dr. Campbell and Dr. Fletcher in the Department of Medicine to be tested on a boy in the Toronto General Hospital. I may say that this material is not going to be published, and that's why I'm giving you some of these quotations from these documents. I, that is Fred Banting, had applied for a temporary appointment in the Department of Medicine under the direction of a senior physician for the purpose of testing pancreatic extracts on human subject. This application was not granted. I was not allowed to examine the urine or blood sugar of the first case, so on. It was rather a pity that this extract of fetal pancreas was not used. We've made extracts more recently, and they're very potent. They passed easily through sterilizing filters, and 1 cubic centimeter of them gives a grand fall in blood sugar, and they are being used actually now in the Sick Children's Hospital in Toronto. Extract of fetal pancreas made by the identical method that we used in the autumn of 1921, and it's a good therapeutic preparation. This was not the one used, however, first in Toronto, but a cruder or less potent one made from whole beef pancreas. The contributions which Professor MacLeod and Professor Collop made to the development of insulin were very great indeed. I feel that they made no significant contribution during the discovery phase. I may quote from a letter written by Professor MacLeod. I suppose it was inevitable when word leaked out to the newspapers that an extract of pancreas was available. All sorts of people wanted to send their children to Toronto to receive treatment and so on. And the inevitable happened. Professor MacLeod wrote in a statement which I made to the Toronto Star on September the 7th, 1921, on the solicitation of Dr. Banting and Mr. Best, I thought that I had fully and fairly stated my position with respect to priority for the discovery. I may say that I was entirely bewildered as to why this should not be considered a liberal acknowledgement of the contributions these gentlemen have made. Such statements prepared on the spur of the moment under pressure, as this one was, can never be entirely fair. When it appeared in print, I saw that I had not given Mr. Best all the credit which was his due. Beside this, I consider that I was just in criticizing the headlines. The headlines were something about cure for diabetes. I gave Dr. Banting full credit for suggesting the experiment of using extracts of duct-ligated pancreas and successfully carrying this out with Mr. Best's collaboration. But this did not imply that I gave these gentlemen complete credit for the discovery of insulin now used in the treatment of diabetes. This has depended on the conjoint effort of several investigators working under my direction, of which Dr. Banting was one. Professor MacLeod, well, he wrote a number of other things which I won't read you. He was familiar with the failures which other people had made and was, I've no doubt, being extremely cautious and anxious that the work in his department should stand up under trial. I'll always have the very highest admiration for the way in which Professor MacLeod applied his fine knowledge of carbohydrate metabolism to the development of the discovery. I'm sorry that the truth has forced me to introduce controversial aspects of the work. There's actually no difficulty if you just confine yourself to the discovery phase. Dr. Clues of the Eli Lilly Company, an English scientist who went out to the United States and became scientific director of the Eli Lilly Company, heard the first presentation of our work at Yale in December 1921. He was completely convinced, even before any clinical trials had been carried out, that an outstanding advance had been made and offered the facility of his firm for the developments. It is perhaps inevitable that some difficulties will arise whenever a number of human beings attempt to work together in the development of an interesting advance. In September 1922, Colonel, later Sir Albert Goodrum, the chairman of the Insulin Committee at the University of Toronto, wrote to Fred Banting and to me and Professor MacLeod. He mentioned certain differences of opinion, and his letter ran like this: I understand that Dr. Dale of London and one of his colleagues is soon to arrive to spend some time studying the work on insulin. We will all wish to eliminate all controversial matters which have troubled us. To this end, I request that each of you outline for me just what part you have played in the discovery and development of insulin. When I have studied your replies, we will arrange a meeting in the attempt to settle any points of difference. Well, the documents are all here in front of me. The document prepared by Fred Banting, by myself, and by Professor MacLeod. And the fact that these are in existence is because Sir Albert Goodrum wanted everything to be smooth sailing when Dr. Dale arrived in Toronto. I have quoted everything that I have quoted here tonight from Fred Banting and from Professor MacLeod, exactly what they wrote down in September 1921. My own submission was very hurriedly written. I was extremely busy attempting to keep up a supply of insulin. This was just before Sir Henry Dale arrived. He knows the circumstances there. There were diabetics by the hundred waiting for their turn. I'll read you one or two of the remarks that I made. I assisted Banting during the months of May and June in the ligation of pancreatic duct to a number of dogs and the performance of pancreatectomy. Banting assisted me in the chemical studies. That was the pattern. He taught me experimental surgery, and I taught him the chemical methods. We were not able, I went on to say, to obtain the correct ratios for dextrose, for sugar, and nitrogen excretion, which Professor MacLeod insisted on. This almost broke up our partnership because Banting thought that I should get these ratios, And I had to search the literature and found that no one ever did get those ratios, that a mistake had been made, and it was the wrong ratio. Our experiments were at a very preliminary stage when Professor MacLeod left for Europe in June 1921. We continued to be unsuccessful during the months of July until the end of July. Well, I don't need to go on. I had to persuade Banting, too, as best I could, to abandon the Haydon, the two-stage operation for pancreatectomy, because our dogs all got infected, and things went much better when we just took the pancreas out at one sitting. I wrote again, the work during the first 4 months, that is, productive months of August, September, October, and November, which was reported in our first 2 papers, was done entirely by Banting and myself. We had the benefit of Professor MacLeod's advice, but as he states, we were given the opportunity conclusively to prove the efficiency of our extracts upon diabetic animals, as will be stated subsequently, upon diabetic patients, before other members of the physiological staff participated in our work. And then I say here, too, that in my opinion, one of the great contributions which Dr. Copeman made was the fractionation with alcohol to give us a pure product. In the winter of 1922, I was supposed to work in the Department of Physiology, but in reality spent most of my time superintending the collection and initial concentration of insulin-containing extracts, which were then given to Dr. Copeman for completion. A little later, however, Dr. Copeman lost the secret of concentrating insulin, of extracting it at all, actually, and many of the patients which had been rescued from coma died. Under those circumstances, I had to go back, give up my study of respiratory quotients, and take over the preparation of insulin again. And then another quotation from my document that's here. My report of the development of this work has been given in less detail than I'd previously intended. After conversation with Dr. Banting and Professor MacLeod, I'm sure that there will be very few controversial points. Well, what a hope. So the whole thing is full of, both Dr. MacLeod's and Banting is full of controversy, I'm sorry to say. The crisis, which was precipitated by the failure of extraction, to obtain potent extracts, of course added to our difficulties. Banting was terribly distressed and left the laboratories for a long period of time. And since there was no insulin for him to use in the clinic, there was nothing for him to do at all. He has recorded in his memorandum that I went to him and brought him back to help me work on this new problem, making insulin on a larger scale. And that's what he did. Dr. Copeman soon went back to his post in Alberta, and Dr. Banting and I eventually got the method going again. In late autumn 1921, Banting was appointed to another department in the University of Toronto and given a salary, not in physiology, never had appointment there. He was given an appointment in pharmacology and received a small salary. I changed from physiology to the Connaught Laboratories and was made director of the insulin divisions from the 1st of January 1922. We both got stipends. I must say we were both anxious to have our freedom and to get into a department where we could have our own small group around us and get on with a problem. That was an interesting time for me. I had 2 offers from the United States when I was 23 years old, both of which paid over twice as much as I've ever been able to receive from the University of Toronto at any time since. When by introducing acetone as an extractive, because it boiled off more easily, and a large wind tunnel, eventually, or crude still, we got everything going again. And it was possible to treat patients and increase the number gradually, and of course the secret of making insulin was never lost. The contributions of the Lilly Company and later the contributions from Dr. Dudley and Dale's colleagues on this side of the water were very great indeed. I must record too, and I'm sorry that this has to be done, that there was one very great bit of difficulty when a letter was published in the London Times by Sir William Bayliss, stating that Professor J.J. R. MacLeod was responsible for the original idea on which the work in Toronto was based and that he should be given all the credit. This caused a real reaction. And I remember taking this copy of the Toronto paper to Professor MacLeod and saying, "I think, sir, you better correct this immediately." And he was reluctant to do so. Matter of fact, he refused to do so. And then Banting brought his batteries to bear, and Professor MacLeod did very, very correctly made a correct statement, giving the credit for the initiation of the work to Banting, to whom it belonged. When matters had settled down a bit, Fred Banting and I both felt that Colepe had really contributed a great deal. At one time, he'd lost his head in the light of the penetrating vision of biochemical, physiological, and clinical advances which appeared to him when he was given the opportunity to concentrate this extract. Colepe and Fred Banting and I worked in perfect harmony throughout the recent war when we were brought together in the National Research Council of Canada. Professor Colepe's many subsequent discoveries place him extremely high on the list of Canadian contributors to medical knowledge. It would have been very easy for me to omit all these personal details, but the story without the personal details has been told time and time again. I had never seen this document of Professor MacLeod's until a few months ago. Some greater and some lesser discoveries in medicine in countries which have been more frequently challenged than is Canada have revealed breaks in the immunity of human nature to dramatic situations of this kind. Historians who are not directly involved will be able to appreciate better than we can the magnitude of the advance. Many of them will ignore both the valleys of dissension and the peaks of personal loyalties and friendship. The months of harmonious and intensive work which Fred Banting and I put in together during the summer and early autumn of 1921 always seemed to us as the period when insulin was actually discovered. It was a wonderful time for us both, and I've attempted to paint the picture of those months for you, and I hope it will be that picture, those pictures, which you will take away in your minds. Thank you.